Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. Part 1 of the lecture spoke about biodiversity. Here in part 2, we're going to talk about evolution and then discuss a little bit about how evolution actually leads to biodiversity. So that's where we're headed here in part 2 of, again, my lecture on Chapter 4. So we start off 4.4, how does the Earth's life change over time? Well, we have biological evolution, right? This is when Earth's life forms change genetically over time. This is a widely accepted scientific theory of how life forms change. So we have a process called natural selection, which is a process by which species have evolved from earlier species. And again, very widely accepted scientific theory at this point. Why? Well, because we have fossil records, right? So evolution explains how organisms changed over time. We have physical evidence of past organisms in the fossil record preserved in either rock or ice, and these past organisms show us, these fossils show us how organisms have evolved or have changed over time. Again, what is the fossil record? The entire body of fossil evidence. It is, however, uneven and incomplete. It's estimated that fossils found so far represent only about 1% of all the species that have ever lived on planet Earth. And here's just one. This is a fossil of an early ancestor of the horse. This is from 35 million years ago. And again, what it shows is that our horses that we see now out there started off rather small, right? You can look at that ruler. They weren't that big. I think about 2 feet there was the length of that little horse 35 million years ago. So it shows that over time, the horse has evolved into the bigger creature that we see roaming around today. So evolution depends on genetic variability and natural selection. All right. So Darwin and Wallace, these are our scientists from the 1800s that independently proposed the concept of natural selection back in the 1850s. And this basically tells us that we have genetic variability that occurs through mutations. What are mutations? They are random changes in DNA, and some of those mutations can result in heritable traits that then get passed on to generation and generation. Natural selection is the environmental conditions that favor increased survival and reproduction of certain individuals in a population. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about evolution and natural selection. Again, it's these environmental conditions that favor increased survival and reproduction with certain traits. What is an adaptive trait? That improves the ability of an individual organism to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals in a population, giving the prevailing environmental conditions. And that's basically evolution in a nutshell, right? You have these adaptive traits that improve the ability. Those traits may show up from random mutations in the DNA. You now have this trait that a random organism has that makes it better to survive and reproduce at a higher rate, right, than other organisms in that environment. So now you have this organism reproducing at a higher rate, putting those new mutated genes into the organisms that are being produced. And obviously, over time, that can change your organism into a different species called speciation. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the next couple of slides. Genetic resistance is an example of natural selection at work. This occurs when organisms have genes that can tolerate a chemical designed to kill them, right? The resistance individuals survive and then reproduce. And then over time, those individuals are resistant to whatever chemicals were designed to kill them. I spoke about this in part 1 of this chapter, part 1 of my lecture when we talked about the insects on the corn. Basically, that's what this is all about. Genetic resistance, evolution, again, causing those individuals that have the mutation to not cause the chemical to kill them. Those then traits, that adaptive trait is then passed on generation to generation, and eventually you have a species that now is totally resistant to the chemical that was created to destroy it. Some disease-causing bacteria have developed resistance to antibacterial drugs or the antibiotics. That's why it's said that, yeah, when you're sick, you want to go get antibiotics, but a lot of times maybe you don't unless you really have to, because the more antibiotics you put in your body, the more your body can maybe become resistant, right, through this natural selection, the cells in your body, and therefore the antibiotics may not work as well. So again, that's what we're looking at here, and this is natural selection. Again, you have normal bacteria in blue and a bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics in the orange. Over time, right, you have some, because of a random mutation in the DNA, you have some bacteria that again have this resistance to it. So then over time, as the resistant bacteria lives and the non-resistant die, the adaptive trait of being resistant to that antibiotic gets put on into future generations. And by the time you get to D, most of your bacteria now are resistant to that antibiotic. So again, this is that genetic variability. This is that natural selection at work. Patterns of evolution can be traced and compared using an evolutionary or a phylogenetic tree. And this is basically a simplified phylogenetic tree or tree of life here on planet Earth. Basically, we have 6 major kingdoms of organisms here on planet Earth. And again, genetic variability, natural selection has led to all the different types of life. Again, all the different biodiversity that we have here on a planet Earth. Now, of course, there are some limits to adaptation through natural selection. The adaptive genetic traits must precede change in the environmental conditions, and a population's reproductive capacity. Species that reproduce rapidly and in large numbers are better to adapt than creatures that don't, or species that don't reproduce rapidly or reproduce in smaller numbers. So again, these are your limits a little bit of the natural selection. There are also some myths about evolution and natural selection that we have to talk about. So let's discuss these 5 common myths. First, the first myth is that survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. That is not the case. That is not what natural selection says. I know when we're younger, we think about it, survival of the fittest, right? The strongest will survive. It's not about being the strongest. It's about having a trait that allows you to reproduce more effectively in an environment. The more effectively you can reproduce, if you can reproduce more effectively than someone else, your traits will be the one that gets into the environment, into the species, and then it's your traits that will be carried on from generation to generation. So again, it's not just about being the strongest, it's about being adaptive to whatever environment you have and just being able to reproduce at a more effective rate than someone else. That's basically what we're talking about. Evolution explains the origin of life. It does not, right? We're not exactly sure how life originated. We think it's through, think it's in these pools of organic molecules that came together at some point. But again, evolution doesn't explain that. Humans evolved from apes or monkeys. That is not the case, right? Humans, apes, and monkeys evolved from a common ancestor at some point millions and millions of years ago. And then what happened was humans went along one tree, apes went along another, and monkeys went along their third. Okay, we didn't evolve right from apes and monkeys. There was something else, something millions of years ago that was a common ancestor of humans, apes, and monkeys. And then again, we branched off in one direction, apes and monkeys branched off in another direction. Evolution is part of nature's grand plan to produce perfectly adapted species. Absolutely not. Evolution is just about being able to reproduce most effectively. So the example I give to this are the human eye. Right? The human eye is really not that great to be on land. If you don't remember, humans, we all came from the ocean. So our eyes are actually millions of years ago, we're used to seeing underwater. Then humans came out on land. Our eyes did have to evolve, but they evolved just enough to allow us to reproduce more effectively and more efficiently on land. They definitely didn't make our eyes perfect, because if our eyes were perfect, I would argue they wouldn't water, they wouldn't get dry, right? How many times are you rubbing your eyes that they're dry, right? You got to put drops in them sometimes, okay? Things like that. If they were perfectly adapted, our eyes, to be on land, none of that would happen to us, right? Our eyes would be perfect, but that's not the case because our eyes originated underwater millions of years ago and adapted just enough to allow us to reproduce more effectively. That's all. Okay, definitely not perfect. Our eyes are definitely not perfect for being on land. And again, next time you have itchy eyes or watery eyes, you can think of this, because that's exactly what it is. Evolution is not part of nature's grand plan. Okay, that's a myth. All right, evolution, part of nature's grand plan, is the myth. All right, it's not part of nature's grand plan to produce perfectly adaptive species, because it doesn't produce perfectly adaptive species. Evolution by natural selection is not important because it is just a theory. That is not true. Again, that's just a myth. All right, it is a widely accepted scientific theory at this point because, again, we see it in the fossil record, right? We're able to trace these organisms, these species, as they go through millions and millions of years of evolution, right? So so again, that's one of those myths. So understand those myths, guys. Okay, very important as we go through this chapter and go through the rest of the course. All right, so now we're going to kind of go back a little bit, right? We spoke about biodiversity in part one of this lecture. Now here in part two, we spoke about evolution, and now we'll talk about how evolution affects biodiversity, right? So we have new species that can arise in two phases. One is a result of geographic isolation, right? This occurs first. Populations migrate or are separated by some other cause, okay? And we'll talk about this more as we go through the next couple of slides. Then what happens is, once you get this geographic isolation, then you get something that called reproductive isolation, right? Mutation and change by natural selection occurs in these geographically isolated groups. This eventually prevents the breeding between these groups, right? And again, if you can't breed and produce fertile offspring, then you're not the same species anymore. You are two different species. And so this is how speciation, or the creating of new species, arises. So the example given in the book here is about the fox, the Arctic fox versus the gray fox. All right, so the early fox population in North America, right? It was just one fox. Then you had one group that migrated north. You had one group that migrated south. These groups no longer intermingled, right? So over millions of years, the group in the north, right, evolved to help itself, right? So the Arctic fox adapted a cold through heavier fur, short ears, short legs, short nose, white fur to match the snow for camouflage, right? The gray fox, or the other fox group that migrated south, it doesn't want to be white because that'll make it stand out, right? So it adapted, and it through natural selection, right, and random mutations in the DNA and the genes. The gray fox adapted to heat through lightweight fur and long ears, legs, and nose, which give off more heat, right? So now you have two. They were the same species. They were geographically isolated. Natural selection took place in both areas. And now you have two foxes that are different species. Yes, they're still fox, but an Arctic fox, a gray fox, cannot breed to form fertile offspring. As a result, now we have two different species of fox. So that's how geographic isolation then leads to reproductive isolation, which then leads to a new species called speciation. Sometimes geological processes affect biodiversity, right? So tectonic plates affect evolution and the distribution of life on Earth because, as you know, locations of continents and oceans have shifted through geologic time. So even if you didn't migrate, if you happen to be on one, in Africa and South America were together, if you were on the Africa side and your buddy was on the South America side and plate tectonics started pulling them apart, well, you're going to be, even though maybe you didn't want to be, you'll be geographically isolated, which then will cause reproductive isolation, which then will cause new species to form, right? So species move and adapt to new environments, allowing that speciation. Earthquakes can separate and isolate populations as well. Volcanic eruptions can also destroy habitat. So again, just kind of looking at the picture here, again, Pangea from 225 million years ago to the present. Again, you can see how the continents are moving, which can produce geographic isolation, then reproductive isolation, and then new species form, which again increases the biodiversity here on planet Earth. Then us humans show up, right? And we decide that we want to mess with things ourselves. So there's also artificial selection, not natural selection anymore, genetic engineering and synthetic biology that has come up to speed over the past 50 to 100 years, right? So what is artificial selection? This is selective breeding or crossbreeding. This occurs between genetically similar species. It's not a form of speciation, and it's a slow process. We have genetic engineering, which is ways to speed up the process of artificial selection, and this is gene splicing is part of this. So what are the steps in genetic engineering? And we're going to talk a lot about GMOs, genetically modified organisms and food, when we get to the food production chapter in a couple of chapters. But genetic engineering, you identify a gene with a desired trait in the DNA from a donor organism. You would then extract a small DNA molecule from a bacteria cell. You insert the gene that you wanted, right? Okay, into a plasmid to form a recombinant DNA plasmid. You then insert into the cell of another bacterium that recombinant DNA that then divides and reproduces large number of cells with the desired trait. You then transfer those genetically modified bacteria cells into the plant or animal that is to be genetically modified, and the result is a GMO, or a genetically modified organism. So again, it's these genetically modified bacteria that have the trait that we want, that we then put into the plant or animal cell, or into the plant or animal, and now that plant or animal is called a genetically modified organism, or a GMO. Synthetic biology is when segments of DNA are used to design and create artificial cells, tissues, body parts, and organisms not found in nature. And again, some of this stuff, and again, it's ethical. Is it moral? Is it not? But some research areas are beginning to do this now over the past 10 years or so, this synthetic biology, or creating artificial cells, tissue, body parts, and organisms not found in nature. So here's kind of basic picture of the steps here of genetic engineering. All right, this is artificial selection, right? So we basically have a pear and an apple. We want a pear that is red. That's the idea here. So what do? We crossbreed the pear and the pear with a red apple. What do we get? We get some kind of hybrid creature here. It looks like the best result is the kind of hybrid pear that's a little darker. We crossbreed that again with the apple, and over time we finally will get a pear that is red, right? That has the skin of the red apple. That's basically crossbreeding in a nutshell, and that's basically how it works. All right, so moving on, extinction eliminates species, right? So extinction is the process in which an entire species ceases to exist. We have endemic species, which are found only in one area. They are particularly vulnerable to extinction. I would argue the panda bear would be considered an endemic species. Background extinction. Now, most of the times we do have creatures becoming extinct at a typical low rate of extinction, right? 0.0001% of all species per year become extinct. Normally, that's called the background extinction. However, what we've seen 5 and now currently 6 times in Earth's history are mass extinctions. This is when you have a significant rise of percentage of creatures or organisms becoming extinct above that background level that we just spoke about. In a mass extinction, 20 to 95% of species are eliminated. Causes are unknown, but could include volcanic eruptions, collisions with meteors, asteroids, things like that. While mass extinctions are horrible, they also have a good part to it, as they provide the opportunity for the evolution of new species. The argument out there is that human beings would not be here right now if that asteroid didn't hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago and wipe out the dinosaurs, right? Because how the heck would we, as human beings, be able to dominate the planet when you had T-Rex and Brontosaurus and Allosaurus and all these guys roaming around, right? They'd be eating us right and left. So that wouldn't work, right? So I guess for us, luckily, we had that mass extinction 65 million years ago that killed the dinosaurs, because that allowed little mammals to start taking over the earth, which eventually led to us human beings. Again, here are going back, we've had 5 mass extinctions already. The Ordovician, 50% of animal families were gone. The Devonian, about 30%. The Permian was the big dying. 90% of animal families, including over 95% of marine species, died. We almost lost life on this planet in the Permian. Mass extinction, guys, almost lost that 250 million years ago. If it had been 100%, we would not be here right now. Triassic, 35%. Cretaceous, that was the dinosaur one, right? Up to 80% of ruling reptiles became extinct. And then now you had that article we read at the beginning of the course, right? It looks like the current mass extinction right now being caused by humans currently. So it looks like, again, we are in that sixth mass extinction, as our extinction rate is well above that background extinction rate we talked about a couple of slides ago. So what happens when things begin to change? Well, species only have three choices. They adapt, they migrate, or they go extinct, right? When the environment changes rapidly, species only have those three options. The problem is many creatures like polar bears reproduce slowly, but environmental conditions they depend on are changing very quickly. That's really the big issue here, guys, and that's the problem. As we spoke about, evolution, natural selection works, right? Creatures, environment changes. Creatures adapt to that environment, right? Natural selection allows them through random mutations in genes to survive better, and those traits then are passed on to generation and generation, and that works fine until the environmental conditions start changing so rapidly that creatures are not able to adapt or migrate, and therefore they become extinct. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing on planet Earth right now, as humans are changing the planet and the environment so quickly that many of our organisms are not able to adapt or migrate, and that's why we believe we are in the sixth mass extinction currently. All right, that concludes my lecture on Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. And as always, I thank you for listening.